Chapter 3. The sound of shuffling steps drew everyone's attention to the doorway they had entered from previously. A woman with dark brown hair and deep blue eyes was leaning against the side of the entrance, with her eyes focused on Kaitlyn. This must be her mother. The resemblance between the two of them was uncanny. "He's right, dear," she spoke gently, her voice soft and melodious. "When the two of you touched, it brought him into our world. If we don't take him and protect him, then someone else will come along and force him into doing whatever they want. His kind are far too valuable to be left alone." Kaitlyn's face smoothed and her eyes grew hard at her mother's words, hiding her emotions behind a mask of her own creation. She kept her eyes off of Jack as she stood from the couch and walked away, moving towards her mother and the hallway beyond. Her mother reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling Kaitlyn to her side before she could walk past her. Holding her close, she whispered something too softly for anyone else to hear, and then released her daughter, letting her walk past. "We haven't been introduced yet," she said, focusing on Jack as she left the doorway and began walking towards them. "You were almost dead when I saw you earlier. I'm glad to see that you're doing so much better now. My name is Chantal Locketcher. You've already met my husband and daughter. I was the one who healed you, as I'm sure they already told you." She moved to the chair next to her husband and sat down, keeping her eyes on Jack the entire time. Thank you for that. I appreciate not dying." Jack began lightly. "Is Kaitlyn okay? I didn't really understand what you all were talking about just now, but it seemed to upset her." Chantal looked first at her husband and then back to Jack before sighing. "I'm sure you at least caught on that we were talking about you." She stopped talking, as he nodded in agreement. "Let us start at the beginning. You are what we call a pater generantis, or in more modern terms, a power generator. Generators can't use magic directly except in exceedingly rare cases, but they produce an incredible amount of it that they can then share with others. They are fairly rare, however, because their abilities remain inactive until they interact with someone who uses magic. In your case, it was touching Kaitlyn's hand." Jack lifted the hand that had touched Kaitlyn's in the hallway and looked at it closely. Everything seemed normal. There were no marks on it that he could see. Both adults chuckled as they watched him, causing him to flush in embarrassment and drop his hand to focus on them once more. "It doesn't cause a visible change in you, but all people who use magic can feel it if they look for it. I felt it when I was healing you. That is partly the reason I was able to heal you as much as I did, and also the reason I was so tired. Each person normally produces a certain amount of magical power that they can use each day. The amount can change with time, allowing for more or less depending. Either way, using more than you have produced affects the body in various ways, most often causing sickness and death. When using power from a generator, it merely makes us tired instead of risking worse. Do you understand what I'm saying so far?" she asked gently, watching his eyes to make sure he understood everything. He nodded hesitantly, understanding what she was saying was easy. However, believing everything and wrapping his head around it all was another matter entirely. "All right, now that I've covered what you are, let me explain what that means for your future." She moved on, though she doubted that he fully understood what this meant for him. His eyes were clear and firm, which was good enough for now. In our society, generators are a rare and precious thing, something that can push a mage to their absolute limits, helping them grow faster and stronger than they otherwise would have. As such, generators are treated more like property, with their owners ensuring that they never bond. "Hold up. What do you mean, property or bonding?" Jack cut in, not liking where the conversation was headed. "No one owns me but me. If you had never run into mages, then that would be true. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case. The fact of the matter is that in our society, you are too valuable to be allowed to be free. Your life is no longer your own. I admit that you could walk out of this house right now, and for a while, you would be fine, but then someone would find you, and then your freedom would be over. It is a matter of time, not an if it would happen, but a when. It is a guaranteed certainty." "So, what exactly are you suggesting? That I hand the reins of my life over to you, people that I know nothing about?" The heat in his voice was obvious as he began to lose his temper. "No, nothing quite as bad as that. What I am suggesting is that you join our family. Kaitlyn will be transferring into your class at school on Monday. Spend time with her and get to know her. She will protect you while you are there." John's eyebrows were raised and his eyes narrowed at his wife's words. "What do you mean, join your family? And you didn't explain what bonding is?" Jack felt his head beginning to hurt at everything he was being told. He no longer knew what was going on. His understanding of the situation had long since disappeared. A bond changes your powers. It is a link between you and a single other person. Usually people who bond are best friends or lovers. In other words, they are people that are committed to one another in some way. When you become bonded, only the other person in the bond has access to your powers, and in return, you gain access to a portion of their powers. You would become a limited and untrained mage at that point, eventually able to use magic to some extent. Your strength as a duo would be second to only the other bonded, and alone you would be able to at least defend yourself. She elbowed her husband repeatedly as she spoke, until his narrowed eyes were focused on her alone. "Who exactly did you have in mind for this bond?" "I thought it was obvious. I was thinking our daughter Kaitlyn would be perfect for you." Her lips were tight as she spoke, preventing him from understanding her mood. Jack sat stunned, his mind going in 100 different directions. "I'm not saying yes or no. There is a lot that I need to think about, but before any of that, I need to know what you would get out of any of this. More than that, I need to know how she feels regarding any of this." His voice raised as he continued talking. "I'm fine with it," a small voice said softly behind him when he had finished. Jack twisted his hips and looked over the back of the couch to where Kaitlyn was standing. Her face was pointed at the ground with her hands crossed at the wrists, and her body leaning heavily against the wall. Her long dark blonde hair hung over her face, preventing anyone from seeing her eyes. Everything about her posture was screaming at the vulnerability and uncertainty that she must have been feeling. "Look, I still don't really know what is going on," he began as he stood from the couch and moved to stand in front of Kaitlyn. "But it is obvious that whatever it is not something that she really wants. I think it's time that I leave. There are obviously some things that the three of you need to talk about and figure out." Jack held his hand out to the suddenly shy and withdrawn girl. "We shouldn't," she said quietly, shaking her head. "I would lose control again if I touched you at all right now." "I understand. Thanks for pulling the metal from my chest and getting me help. It was interesting meeting you," he said to her softly before stepping back. "Thanks for healing me and everything, but I don't belong to the same world as the three of you, so I am just going to excuse myself now." Through an open door on the side of the room, he could see a darkened hall that he hoped would lead to the front door. Not that he even knew where they were, he could only hope that they were still in town somewhere. He had been injured at the time, so it stood to reason that they hadn't taken him far. He backed away from them before they could respond, and hurried through the door he had seen. At the end, he spotted another door and a bunch of shoes in front of it, including his boots. He heard raised voices behind him as he ran towards the door. Without stopping, he twisted the handle on the door with one hand and picked up his boots with the other. Pushing through the open door, he launched into a sprint as he ran over the soft green grass, a remnant left over from the fading summer. The moon hung low in the sky, and the distant horizon had started lightening with the still distant coming rays of morning. The stars in the sky had faded to mere dots with the coming light, leaving the night dark and impenetrable where the streetlights didn't shine. The town water tower rose into the inky night in the distance, providing him with some idea of where he was and where he needed to go. He was miles away from the abandoned building where he had begun the night. At this point, he was closer to his own home than where he had left his bicycle. His parents couldn't afford even a beater of a car for him, so he was stuck riding his bicycle everywhere. He had his license, just no vehicle. The wind ruffled the trees lightly as he passed, the leaves rubbing against each other in the otherwise still night. His pounding bare feet hit the pavement in an offbeat rhythm as he ran away from the Locature house. His eyes were fixed on the dark strip of ground that was the road, using it to guide his rushing feet. 3 streets away from their house, he left the safety of the road and slipped behind a tall hedge, slowing to a walk before stopping to catch his breath. He tied his boots together and draped them over his neck. There was no way he was going to wear them without socks. Sweat dripped from his brow as his still healing body sucked the energy from him. His shirt was wet and sticky where blood had seeped through the bandages. his knitting skin ripping apart painfully in spots as his muscles moved beneath his skin. Pushing his hand under his shirt, he felt at the damp bandages and the previously torn skin beneath them. His shoulder hit a metal light pole that was dark from a broken bulb. The sweat on his brow grew cold as he shivered in the cold night, pushing on farther down the street to where he could see a working light pole. His back was sweaty as he stumbled along, determined to reach the pole of light before stopping to rest. His breath came in short gasps as his expanding chest fought against the restricting bandages. Above him, the street lamp buzzed softly, offering a comfortable background to the dark and otherwise silent night. A sharp crack shot through the air, startling him at the sudden loud noise that came from the dark. His eyes had adjusted to the soft light from the lamp, and couldn't pierce through the veil of night that obscured everything. His skin prickled as the wind moved gently through the trees, making their tips sway against the background of the waning pearlescent moon. Taking in one last pain-filled breath, he pushed away from the pole and looked around wearily, the hairs on his arms standing straight up. His hand ran over his arm, smoothing down the hairs as he looked nervously into the trees. Something felt different tonight. Maybe it was just the knowledge that magic existed, or maybe it had something to do with him supposedly being valuable. All he knew was that there seemed to be a perceptible charge in the air that he was only now becoming aware of. He felt his eyes adjust to the dim lighting as he set off at a run, the flesh of his feet beating a steady rhythm into the pavement. His breathing evened out and was steady as he kept his eyes on the ground in front of him. From behind him, a new noise reached his ears. The soft pounding of padded feet taking up pursuit forced him to look back, his breath hitching at the sight. 3 large beings cloaked in shadow held his eyes in place as he stumbled over the unseen ground. They had odd loping gaits that at times sounded like they were running on 4 legs and at other times on 2. Their glowing red eyes belonged to nothing he had seen before, foreign to both animal and human. He stumbled, his feet catching as his eyes remained on the beings behind him. His head swiveled around, his hands touching down on the rough pavement as he fought for his balance. Digging in deep, he pushed himself to run faster, holding his sprint as long as he could, his boots smacking wildly against his chest. The muscles in his legs burned from the strain. Sweat poured down his face and into his eyes, stinging as he gasped for breath, his stomach frantically trying to expand against the bandages. The wind kicked up as he pounded down the street, cooling the sweat against his chilled skin. The leaves rustled in the trees before being torn off and flung into the sky. The dead leaves on the ground skittered and lifted into the air, scattering as the wind pulled them along. Behind him, he could hear the loud breathing and grunts from the things chasing after him. He could feel them drawing closer with each step, his vision tunneling to just the road in front of him. All thought fled his mind as he concentrated on just running as fast as possible. Nothing existed but the next step, the next breath. Blood pounding hotly in his ears, the sounds of the world around him faded under the pressure. Spots began to appear in his vision as he continued pushing himself. A stitch in his side caused a flash of pain to roll through him, making his legs go weak as all strength left them. Jack found it impossible to lift his legs as his arms flailed wildly. Forward momentum kept his upper body moving as he face planted onto the ground, his chin digging into the pavement. He felt the skin being torn from his face as it ran over the rough ground. The skin on his stomach under the dressing ripped open, undoing all the healing that had managed to occur. Blood flowed from the reopened wound coating the bandages and the ground beneath him, in a slick coating of sticky red liquid. The sound of padded feet hitting the ground behind him stuttered and then stopped as he sprawled across the ground. An odd huffing laughter replaced their earlier growls as they drew closer to his helpless form. His eyes screwed shut at the sudden influx of pain that shot through his stomach and face. Their laughter grew harsher as they crept closer, a rank sweaty smell filling the air around him. In the distance, Jack heard the roar of a powerful engine scream through the night as a pair of headlights flashed around a corner farther down the road. He forced his eyes open as he felt the headlight beams hit his face, illuminating the red behind his eyelids. Above him, he saw the teary water-blurred forms of the monsters spin and look at the oncoming car. Rage-filled snarls replaced their huffing laughter as they saw the car speeding towards them. Each of them glanced back at him in turn, before casting their glowing red eyes to the approaching car, and then running to the side of the road and vanishing into the darkness. Jack closed his eyes as another wave of pain rolled through his body. Tears leaked from his eyes as he tried to block out everything that was happening. The screech of tires only dimly registered in his overly shocked mind. "Mom, help me get him in the car. He's covered in blood again." Kaitlyn's voice echoed inside his head as she leaped from the car and to his side. His eyes opened weakly as she approached. Thanks for the save." His bloody face stretched into a painful smile as he rolled onto his back. Kaitlyn sighed heavily as she saw how bloody his face and stomach truly were. "We wouldn't have had to save you if you hadn't run away in the first place," she said in exasperation as her mother joined her outside the car. Her mother's eyes seemed to glow with a blue light as she stood above him with a severe frown stretched across her face. "I hope you know that this is your fault this time. If you had just stayed and talked with us, then none of this would have happened. There are many new things in the world you have entered, and because you refused to listen, you nearly died for the second time tonight. I will heal you, and then we will drop you off at your house. Let us know when you feel like listening properly. Your life will depend on it, so don't take too long." She gripped him by his armpits as Kaitlyn grabbed his boots from where they had fallen. Dragging him, she unceremoniously lifted him into the car and onto the back seat. Kaitlyn hopped into the driver's seat while her mom climbed in beside him and grabbed his hand. He felt something intangible shift and quiver inside him as she reached for his power. Her grip tightened, and a deep blue-green glow encased her hand. This was the first time he was seeing her use her magic, as a warmth began to spread through his body. The warm feeling grew hot around his chin and the reopened wound on his stomach.